welcome you to this second in a series of academic lectures on the topics of religion and economy, sponsored by Harvard's Business Across Religious Traditions program. I'm particularly happy that we can welcome to the lecture podium here at Harvard Bethany Moreton, whom I'm about to introduce. Before I do that, let me just say another word about the Business Across Religious Traditions program. Many of you are familiar with it. We're now in our fourth year, and the foundation block for the program is a series of executive education programs that Harvard has developed for business executives. We've held these programs now in our fourth year in New York City, in Boston, in San Francisco, and London, and we're doing another one in New York in December. Michael Pewitt will be presenting on religion and the economy in China. The second part of the series is something that we're beginning in January, and that is a CEO series where we've asked CEOs to talk about the current economic crisis and how their own faith or spiritual commitments shape their understanding of leadership and the challenge facing the economy as we move forward. And then the third piece is this academic lecture series. Bethany Moreton is Assistant Professor of History and Women's Studies at the University of Georgia at Athens. She received her PhD in 2006 from Yale University in history, and prior to that earned her BA at Williams College, magna cum laude, where she majored in Russian. Her dissertation, The Soul of the Service Economy, Wal-Mart and the Making of Christian Free Enterprise, 1929 to 1994, won, as far as I can tell, every available dissertation prize that it might have won, 5 of them, from very different kinds of organizations. Let me just list them to indicate the way this work has already been received in the scholarly community. It was selected as the best dissertation in the humanities and fine arts submitted between July 1st, 2005 and June 30th, 2007 at the Yale University Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. It was the winner of the university-wide Theron Rockwell Field Prize for poetic, literary, or religious scholarship. It was the winner of the Herman E. Cruz Prize for the best dissertation in business history from the Business History Conference. It was the winner of the Cock-and-Slay Best Dissertation Award from the Labor and Employment Relations Association, and the winner of the C. Van Woodward Dissertation Award, an important name at Yale University, from the Southern Historical Association. I mean, I don't even imagine any of our books are read by such a diverse audience, much less being awarded dissertation prize by all of them. But it's an indication of the appeal, of the importance, and the interest of this book, which of course has now been published. You had an opportunity to take a look at it, perhaps even to buy it in the corridor. To Serve God and Wal-Mart, The Making of Christian Free Enterprise, Harvard University Press. Bethany Moreton has also produced a number of important essays. I'll only mention 3 of them because their title indicates not only the rigor with which she works, but the verve of her intellectual interests and scope. For example, why is there so much sex in conservative Christianity, and why do so few historians care anything about it, in the Journal of Southern History? Or a chapter in a book, Make Payroll, Not War, Business Culture as Youth Culture, and a co-authored article, Vaya con Dios, Religion and the Transnational History of the Americas. So you can see we have a scholar of great scope, of great intellectual interest, and we are delighted to welcome her here to Harvard Divinity School to talk to us about corporate Christianity, Wal-Mart, and free market fundamentalism. Bethany Moreton.
Thank you so much. It's a tremendous honor, obviously, to be among you here, and particularly for me to have the first opportunity to address an audience at a divinity school, really a group of readers I had hoped to reach. So thank you for making that possible, and thank you particularly, of course, to Professor Thiemann, to Nancy Byrne, to Charles Andrews, who has fed me chocolate-covered espresso beans so that I can be functional tonight, and to George Gonzalez, who I think was really the motive force behind this entire event, certainly from my point of view. And, of course, a big thank you to Business Across Religious Traditions, the kind of program that we ought to see more of, and to its donor, Bruce McKever, who cannot be with us tonight, I think, but to whom I am certainly personally grateful. I wanted to mention, since the book is for sale out front, I've finally reached a way that it's okay for me to talk about that, and that is that a portion of the proceeds from the book, my portion of the proceeds from the book, goes to the Interfaith Worker Justice outfit in Chicago, which has affiliates all over the country. Tomorrow is their big day of action against wage theft, which comes up a little bit in here. And so if you're looking for some socially minded activities tomorrow, I'm sure in the Boston area there are events related to this if you want to educate yourself on that topic. Also to the Economic Justice Coalition, which is our local affiliate of the Interfaith Worker Justice Center back in Athens. So if you were on the verge of buying a book and that swung you over there, I'm sure the people from the Coop would be really grateful to hear that. What I want to offer you here today is kind of a genealogy of a service ethos within Wal-Mart that I'm going to try to draw from the shop floor of Wal-Mart stores up through various levels in the company to the point of their international philanthropic outreach. What I'm hoping this will do, and it is kind of a whirlwind tour through a lot of different kinds of sources and arguments that are in the book, perhaps somewhat more coherently there. What I hope this will do will give you a sense of, or allow us to consider together the spiritual resonances of service work and help us think about the most successful grassroots globalization project in human history, really the transnational movement for evangelism, and what these have to do, both of them, with some underlying economic transformations in the past few generations. So if that's not too ambitious of a program for the evening, I'll trust you to keep me honest during Q&A about whether I'm actually fulfilling that. But let me start with a case that probably a number of you are already quite familiar with. In June of 2004, a U.S. District Court judge certified the largest private civil rights class action lawsuit in history, Dukes versus Wal-Mart Stores Incorporated. His decision allowed 6 named plaintiffs to represent the 2/3 of Wal-Mart's workforce that were women. One of the plaintiff's experts concluded in his report for the case that at the end of the 20th century, Wal-Mart's store management remained more overwhelmingly male than its competitors in 1975. A lawyer declared, quote, "Wal-Mart is living in the America of 30 years ago." But of course, 30 years ago, women did not emerge from legal inequality at work into full economic citizenship in men's jobs, that is, the stable, well-paid factory or professional managerial work that had been the backbone of post-war prosperity. To the contrary, under the stress of deindustrialization, men's jobs came to look more like women's work. Casualization, flexibility, part-time or temporary work, the erosion of benefits, of seniority, of tenure, these generalized to the workforce as a whole the specific conditions of most women's work under an industrial economy. Unwaged household labor and part-time jobs, of course, had supported the American breadwinner all along. The laboring subject of modernity, it turned out, was not actually the sovereign, generic, independent person. He was a very specific dependent person, a husband whose wife packed him his lunchbox, starched his shirts or typed his dissertation, a father whose children were trained for work by the state, a homesteader whose house was subsidized with tax deductions, a union member who earned the wages of whiteness. Without the exclusions that had invisibly supported him during the long period of industrial America, without those exclusions, he disappeared from the economic landscape with frightening suddenness. And of course, all of us now are living in this world of work. So far from being 30 years behind the times, Wal-Mart actually pioneered an economic breakthrough of the sort that undergirds the post-industrial economy generally. And Dukes versus Wal-Mart Stores Incorporated, this class action sex discrimination case, reminds us just where this gap between value and compensation has come from. The second half of the 20th century saw an unprecedented feminization of paid work, both in terms of the sex of the workers and in terms of the kinds of work to be performed. By the mid-90s, the U.S. was home to more than twice as many jobs in retail and other services than in mining, manufacturing, and construction combined. So this female-style work is really now certainly the work that all of us in this room are involved in, much more so than earlier forms of work. In 2002, Wal-Mart passed ExxonMobil to become the world's largest company, the first service provider in history to hold that distinction. Now, logically, you would think that this reevaluation of service work, this move of service work to the forefront of the economy, ought to have forced a new assessment of the people who had traditionally performed it. The service work performed in stores, in hospitals, in schools, restaurants, after all, is the reproductive labor of the household thrown open onto a marketplace, the work of care that reproduces a labor force, right? So you take the work that used to go on in households, put it out on the market, and you would think that perhaps if that were the engine of the economy, that we would have a revaluation of those people performing that work. But of course, instead, the rise of the service economy has actually seen the fall of the service worker. In Wal-Mart specifically, this has been documented in reports showing many workers' annual wages falling below the federal poverty level, for example. Roughly a third of employees work part-time, limiting their access to benefits. And of course, as we all know, many people working part-time are involuntarily working part-time. Courts have ordered payment of back wages totaling tens of millions of dollars in unpaid work that Wal-Mart stores demanded off the clock. And this is what Kim Bobo at Interfaith Worker Justice has called wage theft in her new book by that title, that in fact to steal the time, the unpaid time of workers, ought to be treated as a crime just as much as if someone walked in and helped themselves to the money in the cash register. Fewer than half of Wal-Mart workers in 2005 were covered by the company's health care plan. Wal-Mart's handouts to new employees, in fact, instructed them on how to apply for Medicaid, food stamps, and similar services. Okay, so in fact, this premier service company, the largest company on earth, no one in here thinks that heading off to Walmart and applying for a job on the shop floor is really in your best interest by most measures. Yet in her excellent analysis of Dukes versus Wal-Mart, sex discrimination case, Liza Featherstone at the Nation magazine reported a sturdy faith in Wal-Mart as a Christian company, and in Sam Walton, the founder of Wal-Mart, as a born-again believer, even among many of the women who were suing the company for sex discrimination. In fact, of the 6 named plaintiffs, the people who stood for this entire class of discriminated against workers, of those 6, 4 were active evangelical Christians who reported that their original enthusiasm for their jobs had much to do with Wal-Mart's reputation as a pro-family Christian company. When one young woman first came to work at a Wal-Mart in California, for example, her decision, quote, wasn't about how much they were going to pay. They had values, and I thought, I can get with that. Another woman writing earlier in the company magazine, for example, said, I come from a factory background, which meant that work came first, before family, church, or anything else. You were treated as a person just hired to do a job. That's the reason I like Wal-Mart. I can keep God first in my life. Okay, now, when you find low-wage workers making these kinds of statements, and you're looking at this from kind of a left labor perspective, you've got a problem. Because the labor left has had a very difficult time talking about why people might find compensatory values in their work, despite objectively awful conditions in many cases, without speaking about people fundamentally with condescension. So for secular critics, it's very hard to talk about this. It's very hard to know what to make of this failure of militancy, this acceptance, and without sort of writing it off as just false consciousness, right? But what I want to suggest here today, based on goings on within Wal-Mart, is that to understand enthusiasm for economic visions that do not, in fact, pay off on an individual level, that we need to stop imagining some sort of rational homo economicus at the center of the story. And instead, we might turn to a figure identified by political pollsters in the late 1990s, namely the Wal-Mart mom. This was an actual title. You know how they had the I don't know, what were the soccer moms were the hot demographic one year, but the Wal-Mart moms were a big deciding factor, for example, in how we got Sarah Palin. Because these voters were largely white Southern mothers, conservative Christians, staunchly opposed to abortion and gay marriage, but overwhelmingly enthusiastic about higher minimum wages and universal access to health care coverage. If you want to reach the Christian population on Sunday, you do it from the church pulpit, explained the executive director of the Christian Coalition in 1995. But if you want to reach them on Saturday, you do it in Wal-Mart. Okay, so for a lot of observers, then the question is how Wal-Mart comes to be and why should we care, this icon for conservative Christianity, and what is it offering that makes this identification possible? And what I want to look at here, trying to sort of leap through decades of economic transformations, is really what I think this shows us is a signal failure within many of the responses we generated to an industrial economy, an inability to recognize, as one of your number has famously said, that women's history is American religious history, and that these are both deeply implicated in our economic landscape these days, because both the original industrial labor myth, if you can picture the CIO radical kind of coming over the horizon with his fist in the air, strike, 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 that if that's our icon of work, of labor, then you have to recognize that contained within that definition is a complete devaluation of, again, all those supports that were sort of backing him up, including or particularly the reproductive labor that sort of gets him up and over the horizon every morning. And the post-industrial solution to this failure on the part of both labor and liberalism, if we want to get into that, was to lionize women's contribution and, in fact, to raise it to the status of managerial gospel. And so this is where Wal-Mart has actually has walked through a door that was left wide open, I think, by the progressive left, by the labor left, and said, we see a resource here that is being undervalued, and because it's undervalued, it's actually going for a bargain rate. You don't actually have to make working at Wal-Mart as good a bargain as, say, working at GM in its heyday, if, in fact, no one else is competing for that group of workers, if, in fact, no one else is treating their skills as skills. And so if we take Wal-Mart as just kind of the paradigmatic service corporation, then what many of those service providers have done is sort of take the progressive left up on its offer to treat this work as non-work and to treat the people who perform it as non-workers. Drawing on this idealized agrarian family model that a company like Wal-Mart, which grew up in an agricultural area, right? It never had this kind of history of factories in its original area. So it brings agrarian family traditions inside Wal-Mart, right? And drawing on this idealized agrarian family model that resonated with the early recruits to Wal-Mart's workplace, the male manager now could figure his authority as servant leadership. In this cosmology, men earned their power through their superior ability to serve. Thus, with service as the leading sector of the economy, women found an appreciative audience for the labor that the industrial enthusiasts, whether they're, theorizing financial markets or pushing the CIO, either way, they're ignoring this pool of labor and these activities that are required behind that industrial economy. Now that service is ahead, women find within a place like Wal-Mart an enthusiastic audience for this labor that was formerly labeled unskilled. In response to the new work environment, a Christian-inflected management theory of servant leadership thus made a virtue out of a necessity. So what does that mean? Well, how many people have heard of servant leadership? Is this a term that gets used frequently around here? Okay. By the early 90s, you really couldn't get away from this term if you were reading about Wal-Mart. It had really attached itself to this kind of down-home How May I Help You sort of image of Wal-Mart, and particularly of its founder. A Fortune article from 1994, for example, explained away the discrepancy between low wages and high employee loyalty at the firm with, quote, what Walton called servant leadership. So they're sort of assuming that he invented it. The role of an executive, says this article, is not to dictate, but to provide workers with whatever they need to serve the customers in the stores. Merchandise, capital, information, inspiration, and then get out of the way. But actually, this is not an invention of Wal-Mart. It goes back to a 1968 essay by a former AT&T personnel trainer named Robert K. Greenleaf. Greenleaf, a sometime Quaker and restless devotee of human potential movements, from phrenology to LSD, produced this essay based on his reading of Hermann Hesse's Journey to the East, which is kind of one of those classic seeker texts in the 1960s. But regardless of where he thought it was coming from the time of its first publication, the essay's theological echoes were obvious to the biblically literate. The Episcopal Bishop of Atlanta, for example, heard of it soon after his appointment to the See in 1971. He was inspired by the notion, so inspired by the notion that he dedicated himself to, quote, putting theology at the service of business by way of an executive training program at Emory University. Christian periodicals, as well as management ones, reviewed the work, stating the obvious: Christ was a servant leader. Okay, so it comes out of a somewhat different spiritual path, but it's immediately taken up by people who are steeped in Bible-based Christianity. But at the same time that the servant leader was finding a mass audience in the office, so at the same time that it becomes sort of management gospel, Christian theological interest in service was working its way through other channels. As Linda Kentz and many other, including some of your own faculty, have shown, it was precisely the same advice that was flooding through therapeutic Christian culture in the transformation of the male ideal at home. The expressive, communicative father who nonetheless assumed the weighty mantle of responsibility for those whom God had placed under him. I'm not recommending that your home become harsh and oppressive, wrote Christian child psychologist James Dobson, founder of Focus on the Family, in his runaway 1970s bestseller, Dare to Discipline. Rather, quote, when you are defiantly challenged, win decisively, then take your son in your arms and surround him with affection. Likewise, not only the changes in parenting style and the necessity on the job of making room for women, but particularly women's legal and economic emancipation pose new challenges to manhood at home. And these were met in some Christian circles with an emphasis on male headship and female submission. And again, with Marie Griffith around, I don't think you need me to tell you about headship and submission within marriage. But I want to show a little bit of how this became part of Wal-Mart's model and how impossible it is to understand economic transformation if we stay within the workplace. If the people coming in fact, will tell you that what goes on at church and what goes on at home is more important than what goes on at work. And why you can't find militancy on the job if people are putting their efforts into changing the balance of power in their home or in their church. In January of 1987, on a stage in Kansas City, Paul Faulkner found himself in a familiar role. Microphone in hand, the Wal-Mart director of marriage and family living was speaking on his specialty to an audience of Wal-Mart managers and their wives. The group of several hundred had gathered for a semi-annual meeting that focused chiefly on marketing and operations. This is a business meeting. This is all business. Sam Walton drove the meetings at a brutal pace, commencing each day at the crack of dawn and haranguing the road-weary managers into stunned exhaustion. But in this highly choreographed gathering, Faulkner's talk was not a sideline to the important business of running a retail giant. To the contrary, his disquisition on the changed relationship between husbands and wives was fundamental to Wal-Mart's business model. Husbands, declared Faulkner passionately, were simply blind. They could enter the house at the end of their own workday and walk right past the evidence of their wives' labors, the clean kids, the scrubbed floor, the hot meal. Men must realize that in dual-earner households especially, husbands had one job, but wives had two. Men should start expressing their appreciation to their overburdened wives. After all, hadn't they been motivated this very weekend by Sam Walton's thanks for their own hard work at Wal-Mart? Did they in turn show that appreciation to their wives? Did they show it to the women working in the stores? So he's picking up this model of headship and submission out of Christian marriage, coming through Christian therapeutic culture, but also coming up through secular management texts, and marrying them within a service workplace. And this is a key function. During the late 1980s, at Wal-Mart management meetings like this one, at store-wide weekend encounter groups, and through the company's personal advice hotline, Paul Faulkner promoted within Wal-Mart a widespread trend in evangelical culture generally. Urging the men in his audience to listen and learn from their wives, the Abilene Christian University professor, this is where they go to get their director of family living, promoted a new style of Christian family life. He was well positioned to do so. A 1952 graduate of the Church of Christ College, and this is the literalist Church of Christ, not the United Church of Christ, Faulkner had founded its Marriage and Family Institute. In the 1970s, he developed a traveling 12-hour seminar to enrich, strengthen, and vitalize the marriage relationship for Christian couples. It was later filmed for distribution. As elaborated in such seminars and in churches, Christian advice books, parachurch organizations, radio shows, and within evangelical families themselves, this new ordering of intimate relations ceded significant ground to women in exchange for maintaining masculine authority at home and at work. As evangelical men and women circulated through their homes and workplaces, the revaluation of women's work provided the pattern for both. Men's precedents required respect for the second shift and for women's allegedly superior people skills, now coded as indispensable for management and marketing. Okay, so in this enormous shift into a service-based economy, there's a separate set of skills that are going to have to get imported in, and you can't just go back to the factory to mobilize those. This feminization of work demanded by the post-1973 economy, 1973 is a good benchmark date for a whole set of shifts in the economy that we can talk about. This feminization of work then found in the new Christianity both an ally and an alibi. Anthropologist Elizabeth Brusco has supplied the useful term reformation of machismo to describe the work of evangelical and Pentecostal Christianity in this context. In contrast to liberal feminism, Brusco argues, the Colombian Protestantism that she studied, quote, is not attempting to gain access for women to the male world. Rather, it elevates domesticity for both men and women from the devalued position that it occupies as a result of the process of proletarianization, the process of turning people into wage workers. It does serve to transform gender roles, but primarily by reattaching men to the family. So this Christianity is doing vital work in an economic transformation that's actually going on in many places around the world, not just within the U.S., although it's inflected differently depending on where you are, obviously. As Brad Wilcox has shown then, or argues at least, through servant leadership, many evangelical men make a measurable contribution to what he calls the economy of gratitude. Now this means, essentially, that it is very easy to overstate what this domestication of men in evangelical homes has meant. It does not, in fact, mean that now domestic labor is shared equally, according to people who study this quantitatively. Rather, in this schema, the best predictor of domestic harmony is not an equal division of labor, because that option is virtually never on the table in any marriage, according to statistics that have held almost constant for 90 years. Given little hope of actually sharing domestic labor equitably, many Christian women opted for their husband's consistent expression of gratitude for the gift of domestic labor that women made to them. Unlike their supposedly egalitarian male counterparts in secular marriages, the new servanthood model allowed conservative Christian men to praise and acknowledge women's work at home without thereby running the risk of being required to share it equally. In contrast, non-religious men who paid lip service to formal sex-neutral rights have no alibi for their demonstrated failure to split the labor at home. And they might find it safer to ignore the work altogether or to code it as simply a difference in choice. You know, this one, she mops the floor because the food on it bothers her more than it... between the two, many wives would prefer the former, especially since they seem to have little hope of achieving actual parity. So in the broader culture, the stalled revolution of American women's economic emancipation had progressed only to the point of allowing some women access to formerly all-male labor pools. It did not redistribute the significant penalties applied to women as the primary agents of reproduction and of reproductive labor. And thanks to this failure, service industries like Wal-Mart found that gratitude for women's work and managerial homage to service brought women workers meaningful benefits with little impact on the bottom line. You know, so again, the progressive left, I think, in some ways set up this bargain by not making the redistribution of domestic labor, shall we say, a policy priority in every case, because you've then basically set the price of it quite low, both in monetary terms, but also in psychological terms. Nonetheless, to incorporate men more into this very domesticated model of Christian homes is still a dangerous move because, of course, it risks feminizing men. Within conservative Christianity, generally, there was no ambiguity about the nature of the threat. Don't you know what kind of society we have today? Demanded the Promise Keepers founding football coach in 1991. It's an effeminate society. It doesn't raise men. The former chaplain to the Dallas Cowboys was even blunter. The demise of our community and culture is the fault of sissified men who have been overly influenced by women. Okay? So the closer you get to this convergence of male and female roles on the job, and the more that men are being asked to reinvest in the domestic sphere, obviously you're heightening the danger that we're going to sort of lose a division there entirely. But as long as servanthood could explain why a loss of formal masculine prerogatives actually elevated men's authority, then the danger to manliness might be contained. Organizations like Promise Keepers and Focus on the Family thus strove fiercely to theorize a Christian masculinity for home and office, one with soft hands but not limp wrists. In the culture wars narrative of the conservative ascendancy, then, the argument that there are these economic issues out there, and yet somehow voters keep getting distracted by these cultural issues, and if they would just drop it and come to an understanding of their real interests, then we wouldn't have Sarah Palin. In this narrative, this obsession, this fear of this gender danger, right, amounted to little more than a con job. While you rush to defend marriage or to protect the unborn, this narrative imagines, please pay no attention to the financier behind the curtain. He can shift the tax burden ever further down the food chain. He can offshore jobs, shred the social safety net, reward rising productivity with stagnant wages, and create an international economy on the pattern of Caesar's palace, as long as he periodically hollers abortion or gay agenda. What's the matter with Kansas? Asked the left in frustration. Why do those people in the pews keep enabling a political order that eats them for lunch? Couldn't they figure out that family values was a skimpy fig leaf for an economic vision that would make Darwin blush? Weren't Jerry Falwell and Milton Friedman really rather strange bedfellows at the end of the day? But what I want to argue here today, and again, we're going kind of broad, so you're more than welcome to rein me in, but Christian hostility to abortion and homosexuality was not a soft distraction from hard issues. It was itself part of an economic vision, one that gave reproduction its due. The rise of family values, of intense religious concern with physical and social reproduction, corresponded to the rise of the service economy in America, or the replacement of productive industries with reproductive ones. In a world where production was disappearing from sight, reproduction would be the central ideological battleground. Okay, and it's important to remember, I mean, we all live within this conflation of Christian with family values. And so you have to remember to step back that there was a point within my lifetime when, when the Southern Baptist Convention was not, in fact, anti-abortion. It had a mildly pro-choice position, right? This is historically new. You could not whip up Christian sentiment over homosexuality, particularly in 1890. We were worried about prohibition, right? Because that's a sin against production. If you consume alcohol and you show up hungover on Monday and you're supposed to work a machine, that's a problem in a way that sodomy really wasn't. And remember that when sex started becoming this defining issue within Protestant Christianity in the most recent generation, that this initially the targets were actually quite varied. Christianity Today, for example, ramped up its coverage of sex-related issues first with concern over increased promiscuity after the upheavals of the 60s. So initially it wasn't as narrow as all that. But the focus soon narrowed down sharply to the pair of sexual issues that insulated straight men themselves from criticism. Abortion and homosexuality, crimes against reproduction, eclipsed the much more broad-based sexual issues like rising divorce rates or heterosexual infidelity. So stop for a moment and imagine, had those actually stayed at the center of the revival, the post-1970 revival in American Protestantism, how different the terrain would be, and that we really have to probe the specificity of the family values agenda. Remember, just a few signal moments from the rise of family values. You doubtless remember Anita Bryant launched a campaign in 1977 to, quote, save our children from sterile homosexual recruitment by school teachers. I think your own Ian Lekas is writing about this right now, actually. Her mobilization of conservative Floridians resulted in the removal of homosexuals from Dade County's anti-discrimination clause. Also in 1979, Christian surgeon and later United States Surgeon General C. Everett Koop teamed up with the prolific anti-abortion crusader Francis Schaeffer to promote Whatever Happened to the Human Race. Under this title, a book, a 5-part video sequence, and a traveling workshop laid out the winning argument against abortion for Christians who had previously shown little formal concern, which was the majority. Rational Enlightenment values, they argued in this kind of course, could not distinguish between vulnerable, unproductive, non-contributing members of the human race and any other drag on maximum efficiency. So the argument is actually quite specific about when we say secular humanism, they're really talking about market values, about having to analyze people in terms of their productivity and their contribution, and that the anti-abortion position is in some ways founded on a sort of people over profits kind of position, if you can go there with them. With the machine as its supreme being, according to this argument, perverse, pitiless reason could define people as expendable. In the most striking linkage of these themes in this video sequence, Koop appears in the video posed on the Dead Sea site of Sodom, where he's telling you this is where Sodom used to stand. And as he's speaking to you about the corruption of Sodom, which was not really directly related to abortion, what you're seeing, what the camera is showing you, is little plastic baby dolls floating face down in the salt water. Okay, so I mean it's a very hard image to get out of it. I actually don't show it for that reason, but you have to give it up, frankly, for the associational loop that's being constructed here. And it is really a poignant link between the emotional content of family values and the historically specific circumstances in which they gained purchase. During these same years, the post-industrial economy's accelerated drive to render people functionally obsolete was figured in the imagery of the political left as the dispossessed, the army of the unemployed, the people who are constantly being thrown out of work and out of any meaningful connection to society through being rendered obsolete. Right? So there's a critique of this on both sides. And the mirror image on the right was expressed as horror at the potential loss of meaning in human reproduction. The dispossessed in this cosmology were the children unconceived or unborn because of their economic superfluity. Hence the emphasis on abortion as the callous strategy of ambitious career women who could not be inconvenienced, right, to reproduce, or on homosexuals as an affluent population that's selfishly consumed without reproducing. Okay, it's actually a very specific set of arguments. Meanwhile, undergirding the rise of Sunbelt family values was the long sort of post-war experience of outsourcing state functions to religious bodies. And elsewhere in the book, I show just a little bit of the very well-established political economy of subsidy to a company like Wal-Mart, right? That when we talk about a private sphere, of course, that's sort of nonsensical given the amount of public input into private companies. And similarly, when we talk about a private sphere of religion, it doesn't really hold up in political economic terms. Since World War II, finds historian Axel Schaefer, U.S. government subsidy of the faith industries has totaled billions in tax exemptions, loans, vouchers, grants and aid, and purchase of service agreements to religious institutions in areas like healthcare, education, and welfare. Taxpayer gifts to the sectarian faith sector included donating public land and former military installations, underwriting overseas missions, maintaining the military chaplaincy, and the subcontracting to religious aid organizations. Far from being a readout of private associational life, the faith arena developed a robust relationship with the state along the same lines as many for-profit industries. Legal protection and public funding welcomed as their due, oversight rejected as government tyranny. Now the global financial markets, the suburban megachurch, the big box store, and the Christian home begin to come into focus as something of a unified field of action. In the United States, after all, rather than sharing some of the concrete costs of reproduction through social provisions, we assign the majority of these costs directly to individual mothers. Most of the persistent gender gap in wages, just over 21 cents on the dollar gap between what women earn and what men earn, is actually a gap between mothers and everyone else. At work, mothers are held to stricter standards of punctuality and productivity. They're hired less often and judged less promotable, less competent, less dependable, and less committed to their jobs, all demonstrated in experiments which control for actual differences in performance or qualifications. Fathers, on the other hand, find their earnings and approval enhanced compared to childless men. Okay. Thus, the sacralization of reproduction in the late 20th century guarantees a socially honored position. Okay, by sacralizing reproduction, by saying our primary concerns are reproduction, what have you done in Christian culture? Linda Kentz writes that by doing this, we are trying to guarantee a socially honored position for women who have a deep and realistic fear that without such a guarantee, they will inevitably be judged against men and found lacking. Then they and their children will be left at great risk in a society based on masculine competition, whether built by free market theorists or by liberal institutions. Mothers are particularly exposed by the American system of linking access to important social benefits like health insurance and Social Security to marriage rather than citizenship, right? Especially since the early 1970s, the new freedom, and this is where these economic shifts, when it looks like we're talking about families, it looks like we're talking about fairly small-scale policy issues, you step back and you can sort of see the terrain on which these are all operating. Beginning particularly in the 1970s, the new freedom of private investment capital to seek out a good business climate across national borders has meant that countries offering generous social provisions are at a competitive disadvantage. Under the new free trade model, the model that Wal-Mart is part and parcel of bringing to our public stage, the state must outsource its social functions to private families in order to present the svelte silhouette that woos multinational investment, i.e. a country that tries to provide social services, that tries to make motherhood all of our problems, is a country that is going to come in last in bidding for the maquiladora. The sanctification of reproduction gave conservative men an ideological stake in the institution of marriage itself. So what's in it for conservative Christian women? Men who, as fallible as this commitment may have been, it at least openly acknowledged women's greater economic vulnerability in reproduction, whereas most workplaces still refuse to reimagine their employees, whether male or female, as people with responsibilities for reproductive labor. For women taking on the full risks of motherhood under these circumstances, a husband who understands his marriage as a covenant rather than a contract is a bulwark against multiple hardships. So in the 1970s, the new political economy began to make the unpaid delivery of care a vital resource, right? The fact that you can, again, mobilize this resource that's been sort of held within private homes and use it to rewrite the social contract as well as to reform the workplace. This is a historically specific mobilization in the 1970s, and one that a company like Wal-Mart has allowed us to see. National governments shed their social services in order to attract that capital that now can run after the lowest taxes and run off to Juarez or Shenzhen or even a prison, say, in upstate New York. To the extent that healthcare, child rearing, and elder care could be privatized, which in practice meant largely relegated to individual women, then the state could in effect perform a striptease for international investors, showing them just what a cheap date it was prepared to be. Here, writes Lisa Dugan, lies another root cause of family values status as a ruling ideology in American political life. Marriage, where church and state authority uniquely combine, is an ever more important coercive tool of the privatization of social costs. So if we're wondering where family values as a defining issue comes from, Lisa Dugan at least is arguing in part that this shift in economic terrain means that the state desperately needs you to get married, because otherwise, you're thrown back on the community. Thus, the reproducerism by which evangelical culture increasingly defined itself was a key technology of social control, but not a univocal one. Multiple meanings of family values make emotional sense in contexts which share the common experience of post-war articulation into the world economy, i.e. coming into the world economy under the regime of Wal-Mart and not, say, Ford or General Motors. To become articulated to this system while this service model is ascendant is a very specific experience. Women's domestication of men became all the more crucial for the service work they now both performed. The new economy, of course, had little use for brawn and speed, but it desperately needed people skills. Servant leadership, in other words, was how the service economy made patriarchy safe for postmodernity. So to watch this kind of transformation moving up from the priorities that these women bring into the store, you're moving people out of a very particular agrarian Protestant culture into service work. You're skipping the stage where people run through the factory and, join the CIO or light a candle to St. Bernadette, and you go straight to a point where they're working in a new kind of service factory. And in Walmart, this moves up from the women in the stores who are, on both sides of the aisle and starts to become managerial ideology. And for Walmart, the elevation of service found its male management constituency through the vocational business departments of small Christian colleges, where the new principle of servant leadership interpreted management as the foot washers of the corporate congregation. The timing was crucial, for the countercultural revolts of the late 1960s had produced a crisis of confidence among Sunbelt businessmen. Remember, we're talking about a part of the country that is now coming into its day in the sun in economic terms. Now the big corporations, Blockbuster, McDonald's, Walmart, are coming out of CNN, are coming out of the Sunbelt. But their timing really sucks, because if you're looking for technologically competent middle managers, and you're finally, instead of taking boys off the farm, which is where they've been coming from in Walmart, you finally have to go to the colleges. It's 1968. What do you see? You see an open revolt against, or at least you interpret it that way, against capitalist values and work discipline. And it's not a revolt coming from your future workers, whom, historically we kind of crack over the head when this happens, but it's coming from the managers, the future managers. So where are you going to go? And what Walmart discovered was that a good place to go is a Christian business department. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Christian colleges then helped meet this need with a new undergraduate business degree for a population much better suited to Sunbelt corporate life than the urban and coastal radicals making headlines. Companies like Walmart, Dow Chemical, DuPont, Hallmark cards. These are companies, again, coming out of this part of the country and finding entrepreneurial studies programs, launching entrepreneurial studies programs at small Christian colleges, backing student organizations, creating chaired positions, backing, for example, Students in Free Enterprise, which was a grassroots pro-capitalist student organization that grew up out of a Christian college in Missouri, and that Wal-Mart adopted, and out of which it now recruits a third of its managers. Okay, so it's got its strongest bases in these Sunbelt Christian campuses, and if you come up through SIFE, you are out there teaching Milton Friedman's economics to fourth graders for, trust me, couldn't make it up, for college credit, and then you go and compete with other teams from other colleges who have been doing the same kinds of projects, and you compete in front of CEOs of major corporations, perhaps in Kansas City or Dallas or Atlanta, and the luckiest among you wind up being recruited out of that experience. And this is, a good chunk of this book. And where I want to pull this then in this final section is if you see it coming up from the shop floor, as it were, and into managerial orthodoxy, where you see women sort of disciplining the managers into accepting service as the key value in the workplace. And then you see it being codified in these Christian business schools and turned into the curriculum in many ways of this entirely new category of Christian businessmen, and then turned into an activist platform in organizations like Students in Free Enterprise. And then the final step, at least for the story I was seeing, was kind of internationalizing it. And it happened for Wal-Mart this way. In 1985, the President's National Bipartisan Commission on Central America called for increased cultural ties between the U.S. and the region in which it was becoming increasingly embroiled. The Kissinger Commission, as it was known, addressed what it understood to be the economic liberation of the subcontinent. Central America, it suggested, must now commit itself to economic policies sure to, quote, encourage private enterprise and individual initiative, to create favorable investment climates, to curb corruption where it exists, and to spur balanced trade. So this is the policy recommendations coming out of the Reagan administration in the mid-'80s. But they wanted to point out, very particularly in this report, that this struggle was not just going on the high planes of policy, that alone was not going to accomplish this turnaround that they saw as necessary for Central America. The Kissinger Commission also raised the alarm that communists were providing 7,500 scholarships, university scholarships, to Central Americans versus fewer than 400 to the United States. And to rectify this situation, they invited the corporate sector to step in. And the first respondent to this challenge was the founding family of Wal-Mart stores. Sam and Helen Walton established 180 four-year scholarships each year to educate young Central Americans in free enterprise at a trio of Christian colleges in the Arkansas Ozarks, which is the area in which Wal-Mart is based. Building on pre-existing missionary networks, the chosen colleges set out to create a transnational circuit equal to Sam Walton's vision of combating communism by producing Christian business students from Central America. The students found themselves at one of three campuses arrayed on a rough continuum of American Protestantism, from frontier Presbyterianism, widely recognizable to many people here, I would imagine, through an institution that B'nai B'rith had called the, quote, largest producer of radical right propaganda in the country. There, the Walton scholars overwhelmingly majored in business administration or marketing. They led student business clubs, participated in organizations like Campus Crusade for Christ, and performed at least 10 hours a week of community service, often among the Mexicans and Central Americans recruited for the area's poultry plants. Inspired by the ethos of service that was very explicitly made part of this program, the returning graduates going back to Central America then worked in trade ministries, the media, development organizations, and advisory commissions, as well as in pulpits, parachurch philanthropies, religious broadcasting, and Christian schools.
Many others took active volunteer roles at their churches, leading study cells at charismatic evangelical temples like Guatemala City's El Verbo, the spiritual home of former military dictator Efraín Ríos Montt, who killed tens of thousands of people. Still others became favored recruits to the offices of multinationals like Coca-Cola, Purina, and Exxon. For the returning Waltones, as they were called, brought with them fluency in English and technology, as well as the specific business culture of the Sunbelt service sector. Addressing a group of Walton alumni, the young president of the Guatemalan Christian Businessmen's Association described their shared vision in terms that would resonate back at Wal-Mart headquarters. Quote, "There's no shame in starting small. Cut people's hair, change the oil in people's cars, make hamburgers, whatever. Just make the best hamburgers, offer the best service, and you will succeed." One student, one returning alumnus recalled, quote, "I met Sam Walton twice in person, and I quickly came to learn that financial success and Christianity were perfectly compatible. Being successful and humble, being loving and demanding, being competitive and caring for others, all of these were compatible." The students' Christian testimony, their inspirational biographies of salvation, success, and humility, which of course they're, happy to share, are among the quiet backstories of free trade in the Americas. The official narrative, of course, focuses on the hemisphere's Washington Consensus, right? The term applied by a corporate think tank in 1989 to a suite of economic reforms intended to spur growth in Latin America along the lines of the Kissinger Commission, backed by the lending muscle of the World Bank, which can say, we lend you money and therefore you need to live up to these proposals. These recommendations included privatizing state enterprises, flattening tax rates, liberalizing trade, and relaxing government regulation. The Washington Consensus, in other words, functioned as the hardware of the neoliberal perestroika in the Western Hemisphere. California is another good example these days. But the software could be found in the webs of personal relationships that shadowed the Washington Consensus. A private sector Bentonville Consensus, Bentonville is the headquarters of Wal-Mart, grew out of the particular ecology of the Sunbelt service sector in the era of Christian revival. Its popular orthodoxy of servant leadership circulated between the overlapping spheres of white-collar vocational training and evangelical theology. Both increasingly found audiences in former agricultural peripheries of the U.S. South as well as the global South. So people who are moving out of agricultural economies into service economies, sort of bypassing that moment of Detroit, seem to have around the world a real affinity for these kind of what they frequently call postmodern Christianity, a different take, and one that you see fully elaborated frequently in Wal-Mart sources. Servant leadership, as produced in the halls of post-Fordist industry and postmodern Christianity, offered a distinct cosmology for the service economy. In addition, just to try to take this transformation to its largest possible areas of influence, the Walton program was part of a momentous paradigm shift in the overall missionary movement. In the years following World War II, decolonization movements laid bare the power relations that had supported the missionary enterprise. Without colonial administrations backing them, American and European missionaries often found themselves less welcome abroad than they had supposed. But the service ethos could save the church, the mission, as well as the office and the store. Of the old-style missionary, one mission textbook of the time declared, "At home he was a hero. On the field he was a leader. Now he is neither hero nor leader. He's just a plain servant." In a key theological shift at this same time, in this moment of decolonization and of rewriting the sort of Cold War world to this globalization that we now inhabit, a theological shift, attention was drawn to a one-line text from the Gospel of John. In place of the imperial command of Jesus recorded in Matthew 28:19, "Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations," a conference at the time that grew into the Lausanne movement drew attention instead to the command in John 20:21, "As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." It's a radically different image. It's evangelical authority deriving not from Christ's kingship of all the nations, but from a patriarchal relationship within the Trinity. A familial version of the Great Commission explicitly repudiated the sins of racism and arrogance and pledged itself with humility to a servant heart. So these transformations, each of them in a different realm, actually, I think, together show a remarkable network of personnel, of institutions, of ideas, of texts. The biggest sections of the reading public are reading business advice books or Christian self-help. They're not reading academic publishing. So this corporate embrace then of the Wal-Mart moms and of their Christian service ethos, is this in fact good news, right? And I have to say, I think so, and I say this understanding that that's kind of perverse. Not because their embrace has been free of cynicism or frankly of sinful exploitation, not because I think a family values agenda is ultimately defensible, but because of what it says about people's relationship to capitalism now generally. The classical liberal theories of the long 19th century created the mythic economic individualist only by fencing off the economy from the rest of human life and then pressing into service of industry concerns that had nothing to do with the logic of the free market, right? At the moment where the market is initially theorized, everyone's perfectly aware that you're going to have to go elsewhere to bring the virtue into it, to keep it moving, right? That a fully secular, fully self-interested sphere cannot survive if it doesn't have somewhere to go, if it can't bring in concerns like producerism, pride in your work, the Protestant ethic, delayed gratification, family loyalty. If it doesn't have these resources to mobilize, it's never going to get off the ground. In the theories of classical economics, the neoclassical, neoliberal versions introduced in the early 1970s also had to draft an entire suite of non-market resources for its new context. After all, the post-industrial economy depended on people who understood themselves as consumers. You had to win people over to consumption, but it could not have survived them as workers, as parents, as neighbors, as citizens. This was Wal-Mart's dilemma. The postmodern economy could no more operate on perpetual force and cold economic logic than could the modern economy in its heyday. It must metabolize new human concerns like reproducerism, a service ethic, a desire for transcendence, a yearning for individual significance within a communal endeavor, which I think you see constantly in corporations. People desire to be identified with a corporation. Part of the problem for Wal-Mart and its many imitators in sponsoring these entrepreneurial studies fields in these Christian colleges and elsewhere was that people don't want to be entrepreneurial. They want to work with other people frequently. They want to join in this large communal endeavor. That's an example of a sort of virtue that has to be dragged into the market to keep that form of economic organization running. This is not to deny the unimaginably violent workings of power in economic transformations of every age. The classical political economists divided their time between theorizing the invisible hand and lobbying fiercely for brutal state coercion to force small-scale producers out of self-sufficiency and into market dependence. Incorporating the agricultural periphery into world commodity markets has proved a process drenched in blood, from the sugar mills of the Caribbean to the grain fields of Ukraine and the Punjab. The market revolution in America's backyard, in Central America, required torture and extrajudicial murder, and the latest round of globalization strands millions in economic superfluity, some with nothing left to sell but their children or their organs. Force, then, is not absent in economic transformation, but it explains only bare compliance. Enthusiasm, loyalty, commitment, hope, these have to spring from other sources. And this is, finally, I think, the good news that I've seen in looking at this particular example. No one can stand the unvarnished, autistic neoliberalism peddled by economic policy elites, not even the economists themselves. No one works in a service corporation and actually embraces the principles on which the corporation is functioning. Young Central American hearts were not won to the Washington Consensus by a close study of monetarism. Their loyalties were won singing in chapel, surrounded by people who trusted and cared for them. Markets in the real world can run on self-interest only because other areas of life resist it. Family values Christianity offered a hiding place for free market fundamentalism, a wellspring of communalism so necessary to corporate life. Any alternative vision of economic justice will need to learn from Wal-Mart that there is no bright line dividing hard issues from soft, economic concerns from cultural distractions, the bread from the roses. We will need a servant heart. Thank you. And please make me make sense